I started noticing things that just didn't add up. Every Saturday, Eric said he was off to play soccer with his friends, but when he came home, he looked far too polished. His shirt was never damp with sweat, his hair always perfectly neat, and instead of smelling like grass or the field, he smelled of expensive cologne. He'd walk through the door humming, like nothing was out of place, while inside me, a small voice kept asking questions I couldn't silence. I tried to brush it off at first, telling myself I was overthinking, but the pattern was impossible to ignore. No bruises, no sore muscles, no complaints about running in the sun. Just a calm, cheerful man with vague stories about the guys and how well he'd played. It was the vagueness that hurt the most, like he didn't even try to make it believable anymore. My gut twisted every time he laughed off my questions. That evening, as he sat lacing up his cleats, I leaned on the doorframe, watching. My voice came out lighter than I felt when I asked, "You never look tired after your games? Don't you ever get sore?" He smirked, dismissing me with a little laugh. "Guess I'm just in shape, honey. Not like when we were younger." I forced a smile, nodding along, but inside I was screaming. Something was wrong, and I knew it. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail in my head. The way he brushed off my question, the smug little grin, the cologne that lingered on his skin, it all swirled around me like smoke I couldn't escape. I thought back to when we first met, how he'd come home from real soccer matches drenched in sweat, grass clinging to his socks, and that boyish exhaustion written all over his face. Those memories felt so far from the man who now slipped into the house looking picture perfect. I couldn't stop myself from imagining where he really was when he claimed to be out on the field. A bar? Another woman's apartment? Each possibility felt like a knife sliding a little deeper under my ribs. And yet, I kept my suspicions locked tight inside, because the thought of hearing the truth out loud terrified me. What if I was wrong? What if I was right? Either way, my world would never look the same again. The worst part was the loneliness of it. I couldn't tell anyone, not my friends, not even my sister, because saying it aloud would make it real. So instead, I smiled at dinner, laughed when he joked, and listened to him hum as if our life was still ordinary. But every glance, every detail, every tiny inconsistency kept gnawing at me. My instincts were screaming, and I knew sooner or later I'd have to stop pretending not to hear them. The following Saturday, I watched him more closely than ever. He grabbed his gym bag, kissed me quickly on the cheek, and announced he was meeting the guys. My eyes followed him as he tied his shoelaces, so casual, so confident in his little routine. I nodded, pretending everything was normal, but my mind was cataloging every move. The smell of his cologne already filled the hallway, far stronger than anything you'd need for a soccer field. When the door shut behind him, I felt a knot tighten in my chest. My hands trembled as I cleaned the kitchen, my thoughts spinning in circles I couldn't escape. I remembered the woman I used to be, someone who trusted without question, who believed her husband's words at face value. But that woman was gone. In her place stood someone restless, suspicious, unwilling to be made a fool of. I didn't want to be this version of myself, but I didn't have a choice. By the time he came home that evening, cheerful and humming once more, I was already plotting. His lies were too neat, too easy, and I couldn't let them slide any longer. I needed proof, something solid that would either crush my doubts or confirm my worst fears, and I knew exactly how I was going to get it. The next Saturday, my plan took shape. While Eric showered and whistled behind the bathroom door, I quietly slipped into the hallway where his cleats sat. My fingers shook as I picked one up, the leather cool against my hand. I found a small stone outside on the porch, and with a deep breath, dropped it inside his shoe. Such a tiny thing, but it carried the weight of every unanswered question, every sleepless night, every knot in my stomach. When he came out, toweling his hair, I forced myself to smile as if nothing was wrong. He didn't notice a thing. He grabbed his cleats, stuffed them into his bag, and kissed my forehead before heading out the door. My heart pounded as I watched him leave, wondering if I was crossing a line, wondering if I was ready for what I might discover. But I had to know. I couldn't keep living on suspicion alone. The hours dragged by like years. I tried to keep busy, folding laundry, scrubbing the counters, even watering the plants. But nothing worked. My ears were tuned only to the clock ticking on the wall, each second stretching my nerves thinner. I imagined him playing, running, sweating, until the image slipped away and turned into something darker, something I was terrified to name. When the door finally opened and he walked in, humming and fresh as ever, I knew the moment of truth had come. He walked through the door, grinning, a little bounce in his step, like a man coming home from some grand victory. I forced myself to stay calm, even though my chest was tight. "So, how was the game today?" I asked lightly, pretending I cared about the answer. His face lit up, and with a smug kind of charm, he replied, "Great. Scored 2 goals. The guys said I was on fire." My stomach turned, but I smiled anyway, biting back the fury rising inside me. "That's amazing," I said, tilting my head, studying every flicker of his expression. "You must be exhausted." He shrugged, as casual as ever, pulling off his clean shirt. "Not really. Felt easy today." Easy. The word burned into my brain like a brand. How could he lie so smoothly? How could he stand there looking me straight in the eye and spin stories without a single crack in his voice? I sat across from him at the table, nodding, murmuring the right words, but inside I was screaming. I wanted to grab his shoulders, shake the truth out of him, demand an explanation. But instead, I stayed quiet, because I knew what waited in the hallway closet, the cleats, the stone, the truth. And I needed to see it with my own eyes before I let my rage loose. Later that night, when Eric slipped into the shower, I made my move. My hands were cold, clammy even, as I crept toward the hallway closet where he'd dropped his bag. I unzipped it slowly, my breath caught in my throat. I pulled out the cleats, heart hammering in my chest. The moment I tilted the shoe, the small stone rolled into my palm. Still there, untouched. Proof. He hadn't played a single second on that field. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at it, the tiny pebble digging into my skin. It was such a small, ordinary thing, and yet it carried the weight of betrayal so heavy I could barely breathe. My ears rang, and my knees felt weak. The lies, the fake smiles, the aftershave, all of it snapped into place. The man I thought I knew had been feeding me nothing but stories, and now there was no denying it. I slipped the cleat back into the bag, closed the zipper, and set it down exactly as I'd found it. Then I walked back into the kitchen, forcing myself to act normal as he called out from the bathroom. But something inside me had shifted forever. My suspicions were no longer shadows. They were real, concrete, undeniable. And now, I knew I had to dig deeper. After that night, something inside me hardened. I couldn't look at Eric the same way anymore. Every time he smiled, every time he kissed me goodbye, I saw that stone in my hand, cold and undeniable. So I started watching him with sharper eyes, waiting for cracks in his routine. When he left his phone on the counter during a shower, my fingers trembled as I picked it up. My heart raced like I was doing something wrong, even though I knew he was the one betraying me. At first, I told myself I was only looking for reassurance, something to prove I was mistaken. But the truth was, deep down, I already knew. The screen lit up with messages, some from numbers I didn't recognize, filled with coy little phrases that had nothing to do with soccer. My chest tightened as I scrolled, each word confirming what my gut had been screaming all along. And still, I couldn't stop. One night, while clearing out his pockets before doing laundry, I found a folded receipt. Not from the grocery store, not from the gas station. It was from a restaurant I'd never been to, dated last weekend, for 2 glasses of wine and a dinner for 2. My hands shook as I held it, staring at the neat little print. That was when it hit me. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. He thought I'd never dare to look. The more I uncovered, the harder it became to keep my composure. He'd leave his phone charging by the bed, and while he showered, I'd scroll quickly, memorizing names, times, places. I found a hotel confirmation buried in his emails, and my stomach dropped. It wasn't even subtle. 1 room, weekend rate, paid in advance. My chest burned as I read it, fighting the urge to scream right then and there. but I swallowed it down because I needed more. I started paying closer attention to his stories, asking casual questions and tucking away the answers. "How was the field today?" I'd say, while he casually replied, "A bit muddy." My lips would curl into a polite smile, all the while remembering the dry weather forecast I'd seen that morning. It was like listening to a bad actor recite lines he didn't bother to rehearse. The more he spoke, the more certain I became that I was living beside a stranger. One evening, I decided to make a call. I dialed Chris, one of his supposed teammates, my voice steady even though my hands shook. "Hey, Chris, how was the game last weekend?" I asked, trying to sound breezy. There was a pause, then confusion in his voice. "Game? We haven't played in months. The field's under renovation." My heart sank into my stomach. "Oh, thanks for letting me know," I managed, before hanging up. The room spun, and the last bit of denial I had left collapsed. When I hung up the phone, I just sat there in silence, staring at the wall. My heart was pounding, my throat dry, but strangely, I didn't cry. It was as if the tears had frozen inside me. Everything I'd been fearing was no longer suspicion. It was fact. The stone in the shoe, the messages, the receipts, the hotel booking, Chris's words, they all fit together like pieces of a puzzle I never wanted to solve. Eric wasn't just lying. He was living a double life right under my nose. I replayed years of our marriage in my mind, every smile, every promise, every time he told me I was the only one. And now, each memory felt tainted, like old photographs splashed with ink. I thought about the times I had defended him to friends, how I trusted him when he worked late, how I believed in the man I married. Shame curled inside me, heavy and suffocating, as if I had been the fool at the center of his performance. But beneath the hurt, something else began to grow. Resolve. If he thought I was blind, he was wrong. If he thought I would keep playing the part of the naive, trusting wife, he had underestimated me. I wasn't going to scream or beg. I was going to gather every shred of truth, every lie he told, and hold it like a weapon. And when the time came, he would never see it coming. Saturday came, and with it, the weight of everything I now knew. I didn't follow him, I didn't snoop, because I didn't need to. I already had the truth. When he came home humming, a bounce in his step, announcing another victory, I was waiting. I sat in the living room, the lamp casting a warm glow over me, but inside, I was ice. My hand rested on the cleat, the stone still rattling inside, waiting for its moment. He looked startled to find me sitting there, not busy in the kitchen or folding laundry. "So," I said, my voice calm, almost too calm. "How many goals today? 2 again?" His eyes flickered, but he forced a grin. "Yeah, 2. Why?" That's when I tossed the shoe onto the coffee table, the sound sharp and final. "Strange," I said, leaning forward, "because this little stone has been in your cleat for weeks." "You didn't play anything." For the first time, his mask cracked. He froze, his mouth opening and closing as if the words were trapped. "Vanessa, I can explain," he stammered. My blood boiled at the sound of his excuses forming. "No more lies," I snapped, my voice rising, years of trust splintering in one breath. "While your mother was in the hospital, while I was working myself raw to keep us afloat, you were out cheating. Do you even realize what you've thrown away?" He stood there, pale, his hands twitching like he didn't know what to do with them. "It's not what you think," he muttered, his voice barely steady. That line, so worn out, so predictable, made my stomach turn. I rose to my feet, closing the space between us. "Not what I think?" I hissed. "I've seen the messages, the receipts. I even called Chris. There hasn't been a game in months, so go ahead, Eric. Tell me what I'm supposed to think." His eyes darted toward the door, as if escape was even an option. He tried again, fumbling for excuses, but the words tangled in his throat. Watching him crumble like that should have broken me, but instead, it fueled me. My voice was no longer shaky. It was sharp, steady, like a blade. "You lied to me over and over. You stood here with a straight face, pretending, and you thought I'd never find out. You thought I was too blind, too trusting to notice. He reached out, maybe for my hand, maybe to soften the blow of his own guilt, but I stepped back. Don't, I warned, my voice shaking now, not from weakness, but from rage. You don't get to touch me. You don't get to rewrite this story. He lowered his hand, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the truth, and in that moment, I realized the man I had loved for years was gone, replaced by a liar who didn't even deserve the dignity of my tears. I could see the panic rising in his eyes, the way sweat started to bead on his forehead. Vanessa, please, I made a mistake, he stuttered, his voice trembling. It didn't mean anything. That sentence sliced through me like glass. Didn't mean anything? My marriage, my trust, my nights lying awake while he invented stories, it all meant nothing? I laughed, bitter and raw, shaking my head. You threw away our life for nothing then? I asked, my voice laced with disgust. He reached again, desperation dripping from his words. We can fix this. We can move past it. I cut him off sharply. There is no we anymore, Eric. You broke that the moment you chose lies over loyalty. The man I married would have fought for us, but you... I gestured toward him, my voice heavy with scorn. You chose to betray me in the shadows and smile in my face. That's not love. That's cowardice. His mouth opened, but no words came. He just stood there, caught, exposed, stripped of every excuse. And in that silence, I felt a shift inside me. The rage didn't disappear. It solidified into something sharper, calmer, more deliberate. I didn't need to scream anymore. I didn't need to argue, because my next step wouldn't be words. It would be action. And Eric had no idea what was coming. The morning after the confrontation, I slept like someone who had finally put down a weight she'd been carrying for years. Waking up, I felt a strange clarity. No more fog, no more second guessing. I brewed my coffee with steady hands and laid out everything I'd collected. Receipts, screenshots, the hotel confirmation, even the little stone tucked in a jewelry box like an odd talisman. It looked tiny on the table, almost ridiculous, but to me it was evidence, my proof, my truth. I called a lawyer before noon. Saying the words out loud felt like armor, calm, practical, decisive. I want a separation, I told her, and then I listed the facts, one by one, in a voice that refused to tremble. She asked gentle but necessary questions, dates, witnesses, documents. I answered, handing over every scrap I'd found. It surprised me how neat and efficient the world became when you translated pain into paperwork. The law, I realized, could be a tool for the dignity he'd thrown away. But legal steps were only the start. I refused to let this be a private wound he could hide behind. If he thought his lies would be whispered in the dark and buried, he was wrong. I wanted the people who once admired us, his family, my friends, to see the truth, not as vindictive exposure, but as a mirror reflecting what he'd chosen. So I began planning how to present the evidence without letting anger turn me petty, how to be firm and unflinching while keeping my dignity intact. When Eric came home that evening, expecting things to be patched over with half-hearted apologies, he found his suitcase waiting by the door. You need to leave, I told him, my voice steady, almost frighteningly calm. He blinked, searching my face for softness, for some sign I'd bend. But there was nothing left to bend. Vanessa, don't do this, he begged, but I stood tall, pointing to the door. You did this, not me. He gathered his things in silence, shame thick in the air. The next day, I met with my lawyer in her office, sunlight streaming through tall windows. She flipped through the folder I handed her, nodding with satisfaction. You've documented everything, she said. This won't be difficult. Hearing that, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. For once, I wasn't reacting, I was acting, and that shift, that sense of control, was like oxygen after months of suffocation. Eric might have stolen my trust, but he wasn't going to steal my future. But my revenge wasn't just about court documents and signatures. That weekend, I visited his family, the same people who had always admired me, who thought Eric was the golden son. I handed them copies of the receipts and screenshots. I didn't need to embellish. The truth was damning enough. Watching the disappointment bloom in their faces, the way their admiration crumbled, was powerful. Eric had tried to make me small, but instead, he was the one shrinking under the weight of his own betrayal. Word spread faster than I expected. His siblings called me, shocked, their voices heavy with disappointment, not in me, but in him. His mother, who once adored Eric, sat across from me in tears, clutching the papers I had shown her. "How could he do this to you?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer, but I no longer needed one. The damage wasn't mine to carry anymore. For once, the truth was on full display, and it was Eric who had to live under its weight. At work, whispers followed him. Friends who once praised him now looked at him differently, and every polite smile was laced with pity. That, I think, was my quietest victory. Not screaming, not breaking, but letting his lies expose themselves. He wanted to be seen as the strong, successful man. Instead, he was seen for what he truly was, a liar who underestimated the woman who loved him. And as for me, I didn't just survive it. I began to thrive. I wasn't hiding in shadows anymore, or second-guessing myself at every turn. I had turned his betrayal into a story of my own strength. He thought I'd stay quiet, that I'd shrink, that I'd forgive. But I had found a louder voice than he ever imagined. And that voice was leading me somewhere he could never follow. Months passed, and slowly, the sting of betrayal loosened its grip on me. I began filling my weekends with things that made me feel alive again. Long walks in the park, coffee with friends I had neglected, even joining a local women's soccer team. The first time I laced up my own cleats, the air smelled of fresh-cut grass, and I laughed at the irony. For once, the field was mine, and every sprint, every kick, felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. I rediscovered a kind of joy I hadn't felt in years. My body ached after practice, but it was the good kind of ache, the kind that reminded me I was strong, capable, and free. The women on the team became more than teammates. They became a sisterhood, a support system that lifted me up when I doubted myself. Every laugh we shared on the sidelines stitched my heart back together, thread by thread. And in quiet moments, I realized something important. Eric hadn't broken me. He had simply forced me to remember who I was before I ever tied my worth to his approval. I was more than his wife, more than his lies. I was Vanessa, resilient, determined, and finally free. One afternoon, I ran into him at the supermarket. I had just finished practice, still in my team jacket, hair tied back, cheeks flushed from laughter with the women who had quickly become my second family. And there he was, standing by the produce aisle, disheveled, alone, his shoulders slumped as though the world had pressed him down. For a second, our eyes locked, and I could see the flicker of shame cross his face before he tried to mask it with a weak smile. "Vanessa," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. He stepped closer, clutching his basket like it was a shield. "I made a mistake. Can't we try again?" The audacity of it almost made me laugh out loud. Months of silence, of me building a new life brick by brick, and here he was, hoping for a do-over, like the past could be erased with a few pathetic words. I didn't owe him kindness, not anymore. I looked at him, not with anger, not even with sadness, but with the clarity of someone who had moved on. He was smaller than I remembered, not in size but in spirit, like a balloon that had lost all its air. And in that moment, I realized he wasn't my problem anymore. His life, his shame, his loneliness, that was his to carry. Mine was waiting outside those doors, bright and unburdened. He took a step closer, his voice breaking. "Vanessa, please. I know I ruined everything, but I still love you." His words slid off me like water on glass. There was a time when those pleas would have cracked me wide open, when I would have clung to them like a lifeline, but not anymore. I wasn't standing in front of the man I once loved. I was standing in front of the man who had destroyed that love, pebble by pebble, lie by lie. I straightened my shoulders, met his eyes, and let a small smirk curl at the corner of my lips. You should have watched where you stepped, I told him, my voice steady and cool. The stone told me everything. For a moment, his face crumpled, confusion and regret tangling in his expression. But I didn't wait for an answer. I turned, pushed my cart forward, and walked away without a backward glance. The automatic doors slid open, and the sunlight hit my face, warm and bright. My chest felt lighter than it had in years. Eric was behind me, his lies, his betrayal, his emptiness. All of it stayed in that aisle. Ahead of me was only freedom, laughter, the game waiting on the field, and a life that finally belonged to me. For the first time in a long time, I was exactly where I was meant to be,